right. Can everybody hear me well out in the back? Awesome, awesome. So the Louisiana Native Plant Society defines a native plant as a plant that has an evolutionary history at a site. And that can be a plant species or it can be a group of genotypes of that plant species. Can anybody in the audience maybe tell me why we care that it's a native plant? We're at a native plant conference. I hope that we have a few people that can.
It's into the ecosystem with all the insects, microbes, birds.
Yeah, like everything's adapted to deal with that plant. It's not disrupting the ecosystem. Any other reasons?
Adaptation, it offers lots of ecosystem services, hydrology.
Ecosystem services, right? You were going to say tolerance, I think. So yeah, they tolerate the environment, they survive well, they do well there. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it means for a native plant to not do those things, what it means, or how we can tell if a native plant is not fulfilling those roles, and then a little bit about my research that deals with that issue. And like I was introduced, my name is Braden Doucet. I'm a master's student at the University of Louisiana. I'm in Dr. Nicholas Coyer's lab of plant adaptation and evolution. And I'm going to be presenting Grassland Gumbo, investigating local adaptation to spice up Cajun Prairie restoration. And it's all right if you're not familiar with a few of the words, we'll bring it back down and talk about some basic concepts before we get into the meat of the presentation. So, So local adaptation, okay. Species consist of populations of individuals. So if you have a species range, like shown on this slide, everywhere there's red is where the species occurs. There's not just a plant and then a couple meters a plant, a couple meters a plant. What actually happens is that there are these somewhat discrete populations of plants that all intermix and interbreed. And what comes out of that are these gene pools that these populations have. And if you have a plant that has a species range of this big, those populations can experience completely different things. So for like a plant might have to deal with something to survive in Louisiana, like heat or a long growing season, or maybe like a 70-day drought like we had last year. Whereas in Montreal in Canada, they might have to deal with freezing temperatures, prolonged. They might have to deal with shorter growing seasons, and then they don't have to deal with as many insects or anything like that. So these two different selective pressures can occur on these populations, and now what you have is two diverging populations genetically, evolutionarily. They have different traits that are being selected for, almost like an incipient speciation type of concept. And that leads to this idea of local adaptation. So these populations, because they're evolving with their environment, they become specialized to that environment. And that just means that the native population of this same plant species is going to have a higher fitness or survival and reproducibility than a non-native population's fitness. So it does better in its environment, those local genotypes, than the non-local genotypes. And in the meta-analyses that we have in population genetics, we have about 71% reporting are locally adapted. So these plants are actively doing this. They're actively evolving to their environment and becoming better adapted. And some of the things that can contribute to that are selection, like we had talked about, a large population size, standing genetic variation, and mutation. And this graph is just showing what that would look like. So on the x-axis, we have the climactic distance of your plant from your test site. So it's where we're testing if it's native. And then we have relative fitness, so just how well it survives and reproduces on the y-axis. And there's a peak at 0, and that peak represents the native plants are doing really well there. And then as you move away from 0 in either direction, the plants start to perform a little bit worse. And that's what it means for a plant to be locally adapted. Its native site does better than the non-native sites. Conversely, we can have maladaptation. And maladaptation is whenever a non-native plant's population's fitness is actually higher than the native population's fitness. So this can happen due to a lot of reasons, but primarily we're going to talk about low population size and rapid environmental change. And that's what these two graphs show. So if we have low population size, we can potentially not have a lot of genetic variation, and then we can also have genetic drift acting. And on that top graph, it looks just like this past graph, but there's a dip in the middle, and that's where the native population is just not doing well because it couldn't have been selected for it to do well in its environment. In the bottom graph, it's this same graph again, but shifted to the right. And if you think of the climactic distance as something like a combination of heat and precipitation, with the right being like drier and hotter, left being colder and wetter, then it seems like the optimum environment, or the optimum fitness is found in the hotter and drier environments. So this would be the case of like, if you were trying to plant something here, but the native stuff doesn't do well here, instead the Houston originated stuff does better here. It's a little bit hotter and drier there. And this is something that we have seen in some of the populations for Mimulus guttatus that we study in our lab. And then I think this is the final slide of like the background information before we get into the meat. So what is a prairie? A prairie is a grassland ecosystem that is generally devoid of trees. So you'll look as far as you can see, it's just going to be grasses and wildflowers. Really pretty. Oftentimes there's big ruminants and red wolves and things like that. And they're created by low water availability generally. And then these disturbances that'll come through like fires or hurricanes or ruminants, and that'll keep the trees out. They are considered these underground ecosystems because I think 70 to 100%, depending on the time of the year, of the ecosystem's biomass is actually below ground. So they're putting a ton of root mass into the ground because they're adapted to these fires rolling through. They're adapted to these ruminants munching on the top. And they build up these really fertile soils that are awesome for human development and agricultural use. And that leads us to the Cajun Prairie, which is our prairie. So in that shaded area is where the Cajun Prairie historically was, and it's a subset of the greater Gulf Coast Prairie system. Now, we get a ton of rain in Louisiana. We are actually a forest climate zone, is generally what we're thought to be. But we have this shallow clay pan that exists below the surface that doesn't allow the trees to actually access the water beneath the ground. But the grasses and the wildflowers are able to penetrate the clay pan and access that water. So we get this unique prairie system that has evolved here. And we had about 1 million hectares of it in the past. There were bison and red wolves. If you're from Lafayette or familiar with the area, about 7/8 of Lafayette Parish was considered to be historic Cajun Prairie. And the swamp on UL's campus, a lot of people don't know, but it was historically like a bison stomping ground. So they kind of slosh around in the mud, compact it, and then it ended up being a depression in the land. So at some point, UL had thought it was really pretty, and they put some cypress trees to make it like a nice little ceremony hall. And I think during one of the world wars, I can't recall which one, they had flooded it to have a water reservoir in case of somebody firebombed the school. And then now it's the swamp that we have today. But historically, it was prairie and bison stomping around. Now, most of this prairie has been lost due to agriculture and city development. So we've gone from about 1 million hectares to 1,600 hectares. We're left with about 0.16% of that historic prairie. And it's considered critically imperiled now. So we're at risk of losing it to be gone forever. And most of the populations that were left were found along railroads, and these railroad right-of-ways were mowed kind of infrequently enough to still create some sort of disturbance that simulated like a fire. It cut the above ground biomass, get rid of the trees, and still allow these plants and wildflowers to proliferate. This is actually a picture of me, Larry and Lant, who had shown us around, and Dr. Coyers, my boss, in a Cajun Prairie remnant. That's Highway 14 on the right in Kaplan, and then there's like an old railroad on the other side of that. It's just like a 30-foot stretch. This is what's left of that ecosystem. There's a lot along Highway 14 actually. And these populations, because they're just like on the side of the road, sometimes a farmer or somebody that lives next to one will see it's a very weedy looking ecosystem. And so they'll decide, okay, I'm mowing my grass, let me mow that for them too. And it kind of degrades the ecosystem whenever people do that. So we have these temporally and spatially isolated ecosystems now because people are just mowing them randomly. They're split up by roads and agricultural fields. And that creates very small population sizes. But luckily we have an awesome restoration community like the Acadiana Native Plant Project and the Cajun Prairie Habitat Preservation Society are doing awesome work to help restore these plants and these ecosystems, and they're really focusing on using native local genotypes, plants that they source from these restorations, and making sure that we're keeping to what was locally adapted here. But there hasn't been a ton of research on the actual fitness of these plants from these remnants. And that story of the Cajun Prairie going from this huge 1,000,000 hectare to just 1,600 hectares is not just a story. And this is a graph that I want to use to describe a little bit about what happened there. So on that x-axis that we have, it's as you move through time from past to present. The y-axis is population size. And then the colors are, if you think of it as like genetic variance. So as you move through time, and then this is your Cajun Prairie, you move through time, somebody builds a rice field, your population's lowered. You lose some genetic variance whenever you do that. Go through some more through time, somebody builds like a Dollar General or a Rouse's. They're pretty common throughout the Cajun Prairie. You'll lose some more individuals, and then eventually you're left with not a lot of genetic variation. It's just orange at the end, right? And the orange isn't necessarily what was the dominant thing to begin with. It's just what happened to make it through. So our current population's genetics might not reflect what was actually there at the beginning for the historic populations. And we know from population genetics theory that maladaptation is most prevalent in small populations like we have within the Cajun Prairie. So there's a lack of genetic variation, and then we also know it could be maladaptive. And this is really important in a changing world with global climate change, where plants are adapting and dealing with new environments and selective pressures. We have agricultural runoff, herbicides, pesticides, changing climates. Plants have to deal with new things, and they need genetic variation for selection to actually act upon that and make them better in those new environments. So Dr. Quiries and I sat down and we said, okay, there's classic signals of low population size, temporally isolated population, and a changing climate in this system. That's a huge indicator that there might be maladaptation. And we know that we have a restoration community that really wants to keep using local genotypes, which is awesome, but we need to make sure that we're doing the good restoration techniques that are informed. And so we said, well, why don't we make my master's thesis be a common garden that's testing that? Why don't we test how well the Cajun Prairie plants actually stack up compared to things that aren't from here? And so that's what we do. It's called a common garden. That's a picture of that. It's really cool. We have about 20,000 square feet of landscape tarp laid right now, but we're actually getting ready to plant in a few weeks is what it'll look like. So a common garden is just an experimental design technique where it allows you to standardize for the emergent properties of phenotypes being like genes and your environment. You can't just go to the Cajun Prairie, measure a plant, take its genotype, go to Montreal, measure a plant, take its genotype, and then compare those two things. Because the measurements that you're taking of those plants are the result of the genes and the environment interacting. So if you want to be able to compare genotypes, you have to standardize the environment to decouple those two things. And we use a common garden to do that by standardizing the environment. And then we decided the species that we're going to use are little bluestem and switchgrass. These are dominant grasses of the prairie, and they're widespread. And these grasses, because they're dominant, they make up most of the ecosystem function. So these are building the ecosystem and also responsible for a lot of the function that we get out of a Cajun Prairie. So we decided to use these to really start this effort into seeing how well our stuff has survived through this process. Both of these have documented patterns of local adaptation, so we know that they should be adapting to their environment. And then we know that switchgrass too is a bioenergy crop. There's a lot of resources out there for us to be able to utilize switchgrass and understand it better. Think about $63 million has been put by the Department of Energy into switchgrass as a biofuel crop. So it's got a lot of resources. Most of the background, this is just kind of like a picture essay of what I've been doing, what it looks like to get a master's at UL right now, what it looks like to do research in the Cajun Prairie. So first, if we want to do a common garden, we need to actually get the plants. That's the step one. So we had to go scout remnants. We had to create some protection areas to prevent random homeowners and farmers from mowing the weedy plots, And then we actually have to grow and germinate the seeds. So this is just, on the left is a picture of me, Larry Alain, and Dr. Coyers in the Cajun Prairie. This is that same photo that I showed earlier, Highway 14, Ancient Railroad, that 30-foot stretch of Cajun Prairie. This is, if you see Dr. Coyers in the green shirt, he's actually looking down his leg because he realized he just stepped in a large pile of fire ants, which are pretty pervasive. So I like to look at this photo if he puts a lot of work on me. Immediately to the right of that is a monarch caterpillar, and that's at one of our most degraded Cajun Prairie sites. I thought it was really cool to be able to see that. I had never seen one in person before, so I think it's really cool that they have this much ecosystem function left in them, even the really degraded sites. On the right is our lab manager helping me spray paint some of these protection signs that I'll show in a slide next, that just tell people, hey, please don't mow. They're not always effective. Sometimes they mow over the signs, but. So on the left, that is, I believe, one near Lake Charles. I think it's Robbie Maxwell's truck. That's the protection sign out in the field, and it just says, hey, please don't mow. This is a prairie remnant, and then it has my phone number on there. To the right of that is me and my girlfriend. We're going to collect rhizomes and seeds at a remnant out in Texas. One of us, I'm not going to name names, did not check and see if it was open, so we drove 4 hours, and it was not open. It was a good car ride home. On the right of that is that same prairie on the left, but in the winter whenever we're actually going to collect seeds. I just thought it was a really cool picture. It looks completely different. It's really pretty. All the black liatris stalks sticking out of the ground just really make it for me. So at the end of all of our collections, this is what our accession panel looks like. So everywhere where there's a point is where we're going to have a plant population grown at the UL Ecology Center. I did not go collect all of those. That would have been crazy to do in a semester. Dr. Tom Younger from the University of Texas at Austin is a quantitative geneticist that's helping us out a ton. He's done a ton of research on switchgrass, so he's helping us. We're able to take clones of his things that he's already genotyped and has a lot of data for. And then the USDA's GRIN database is also helping us out. They sent us a lot of the little blue stem seeds. So it's a collaborative effort. I definitely only did the coastal prairie stuff and was not able to hit all of these sites. So we're getting into the phase where we're planning out the common garden. We just finished laying the landscape tarp. We're going out in about 2 weeks to go visit Tom Younger and collect plants from his experiment and then put them with ours into the field. So it's kind of picking up right now. And once we do that, we'll have those growing for a couple of years, and we'll be measuring different traits as they're growing. So how well do they survive? What is the biomass that they produce, tiller number, growth rate, flowering time, surface area? All of these things can give us an idea as to how fit these plants are, how well they fit into this environment, how well they do. This is just another picture of that, what it's going to look like in the common garden. It's 20,000 square feet of black landscape tarp in Louisiana, so it kind of sucks, but this is what it's going to look like. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we'll do with that data. What is it going to look like whenever we actually analyze the data that we collect? And so this is just an example that we might have. So this graph is, the x-axis is the average temperature of the accession origin. The plant, where does it come from? What's the average temperature of that place? The y-axis is survival or fitness. So how well do these plants do depending on where they're from? And you can see Michigan is pretty low on there. It's from a low environment, and it might not do, or it's low temperature environment, it might not do too well. This is all theoretical, it's dummy data. In the middle, we might have Louisiana not coming out on top. It might be that the Texas actually performs a little bit better, somewhere a little bit hotter, a little bit drier, where their historical climate is matching now our contemporary climate. And that would be the example of an adaptation lag. Climate change is happening faster than evolution can keep pace with, and this would be a signal of that. And like I said, we've actually seen this in some of the model species that we study in our lab, like Mimulus guttatus, the common monkey flower out on the west. And so this might mean for restoration purposes, maybe we take things from the Texas coastal prairie sites and incorporate them into the Louisiana prairies. That's not on my call, I'm just here to collect information, so don't get mad at me if they do that. Additionally, we might not see that pattern. We might see that the Louisiana stuff still comes out on top. These are really resilient ecosystems, and they come with a lot of genetic diversity. The Louisiana plants, so this is geographic distance from the Cajun Prairie, and then survival and fitness on the y-axis. If you're 0 feet away from the Cajun Prairie, so you're in the Cajun Prairie, you might do the best, and that's a very real possibility. And then as you move away from the Cajun Prairie, you don't do as well. Even though you're in the same species, you're just not locally adapted to that area. And that would be evidence that our stuff is keeping pace with climate change, and that bottlenecking hasn't really affected the populations too much. And that would be an awesome thing for us to see. I would really like for that to be the case, because also we have a lot of restoration work that's already been done, that we don't have to worry about changing anything. And I think that is it. I've already done a ton of work. I don't have too much data to show for it, but there's been a ton of work, a ton of networking, and I definitely couldn't have done it on my own. So these are all people that I just wanted to thank. And thank you all too. I'll take any questions.
How are you measuring fitness?
So the main points, a master's degree is 2 years, 2.5 years. So my specific measurement of fitness will mostly be survival. That's our big thing. If survival is low, then you obviously can't survive there. You're not adapted there. We're also going to look at growth rate, biomass in production, because these are highly competitive systems that are very dense. So if you produce a lot of biomass, you're doing pretty good. And then flowering time, because we don't want it to deviate too much from the stuff that we have already. So if you're doing really well, but you're not flowering at the same time, you're probably not going to mix in with the other stuff that's already here.
What is tiller number? Yeah.
So some of these plants, they produce tillers, so that it's like a little rhizome will come out, and then it'll be like a new stalk. They like grow in like underground stalk, underground stalk, underground stalk.
I was wondering if the reverse is possible too. So if someone were to do a similar study in Michigan, and they were to bring plants from Lafayette to Michigan, they would probably see the same thing happening, right?
Yes. And people do that. So Tom Younger, that's doing this, he actually has 10 common gardens spanning a latitudinal gradient across the U.S. And he's doing functionally that, but he's developing he's not doing Cajun Prairie research, he's doing a development for biofuel. So that's why he has 10.
If you were to gather the seed, can you go back to that slide? I have a field that looks like that. I want to know the stalks you were talking about.
The Liatra stalks?
Yeah, is that where you gather the seed from?
Not from the stalk specifically, but from this remnant, yes.
Okay, so how did you gather the seed from there?
So there's a ton of different plants in here. I just recognized which plants I was looking for. I'm looking for little bluestem and switchgrass. So little bluestem and switchgrass. So I just went and...
You didn't collect the other stuff?
Sorry.
That's what I'm saying.
I collected a little bit for my mom, but I'm not a gardener. I don't have a green thumb. Okay.
So are you measuring multiple generations and to gauge success? So, like, for instance, these plants that have some type of plasticity to adapt within their own range. So over time, multiple generations, are you collecting seeds from plants that are not successful, even though they're making seeds, but then kind of watching them and seeing what they might do? Also, are there other factors, you're taking in reproductive support for success? Because, asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction, seeds and all these types of things, like even root depth. So are there multiple factors you're taking into account? Okay.
Yeah, so these plants are primarily long-lived perennials, and they reproduce asexually most of the time. There's not a lot of seed recruitment in prairies, from my understanding. So we don't do a ton with the seeds, as far as that being like a measure of fitness or reproductive success. We get to the asexual success by how wide these plants are growing, because, right, if it's just one stalk, that's that tiller, but every time it asexually reproduces, it produces another tiller. And then so that's how we're getting at that. And then we're not doing anything with multiple generations just because these are long-lived perennials. Nobody knows how long a prairie plant is. You can't really tell. They don't have rings like trees. Yeah. So they're presumed to be, some can be older than trees. Nobody really knows.
Well, multiple generations to select the seeds from one seed and connect, see how well they adapt, and, and
oh, okay, I see.
Have that case, in their genome to adapt.
I see.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Maybe Texas plants might have this robustness, but, Louisiana plants can catch up,
Yes. So we're measuring all the same phenotypes, but just doing it every year. So we'll capture that within the data. Yeah.
Are your fields irrigated, or are you just using natural precipitation?
So because we're doing this to make sure that these are restoration adapted plants, like we want them to grow here without irrigation, we're going to water them in to prevent transplant shock, and then we're just going to let them be. If they die, they die. Death is data for us, so that's what's important.
I think I missed what you were saying. So you're collecting seeds and plants, but what are you planting in your common garden?
So for little bluestem, yes, it's going to be, we're growing out the seeds is what we've done.
So you're growing out seeds that you collected from these sites, but then also you got from these other dozens.
For little bluestem, because I found that it personally doesn't transplant as well from plugs. From switchgrass, that one will be plugs.
Oh, plugs.
Yeah.
And those plugs came from all those sites.
All those sites and the remnants, yeah.
And so each site is sending you how many?
Each site will have one.
One.
It's just we're more functioning on capturing a ton of populations rather a lot within the populations. Because if you have a lot of nearby populations, you kind of capture that similar data.
I have another question.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
There's one more. We'll go back.
Did you make any of the northern prairies outside of the coastal range?
I did. So Chris Doucet from the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, I don't know if he's here today, he was able to take me to a bunch of the ones in Kisatchie and showed me around. So that was awesome. They're really cool prairies up there. Just you'll be in the middle of a pine forest and then just suddenly stops and it's a prairie. It's really awesome.
So they'll be included in the work?
Yes, those will be included in there.
The prairie up there, that's in Louisiana, you said?
Yeah.
On the left and the right, that's just at different times, right?
Yeah, correct.
And the one, okay, so first question, I have two.
Okay.
The first question is, don't you think that the state of Louisiana should, within the Cajun Prairie, on the roadsides, restore the prairie and protect it with state signage that says do not mow and quit mowing the roadsides? And then also in Texas, did you find at that prairie, is there a similar organization to the Cajun Prairie that helps with to protect and restore prairies?
So
what's the Texas equivalent to our Cajun?
yeah, so for the question one, I wish that they would. I don't have the power to make them do that. I know Larry and Larry and them have gotten some.
You can write legislation with your representative, and you can bring it to the floor.
How much of the land is private?
Let me finish this question first. So there are some protection zones that have been established that are really awesome work that they did in the past, and those have survived really well. Actually, there's a ton of biodiversity in them. Some of them, I did meet with some of the people from the Department of Transportation and talk with them about that. The actual head superintendent for all of Louisiana's roadsides is who I talked with, and he had some really cool opinions. He's actually getting his master's in like environmental conservation or something like that. It's just like pushing it through the bureaucracy is the hard part, and then they said that they would love to. It's just like actually getting the people at the top to listen. And then, can you remember the second part of the question? I forgot.
Well, in Texas, what's
yeah.
like? Did you find an organization, or like is it equivalent, or?
So we have a coastal prairie conservancy in Texas now. They're really awesome. Their stuff isn't as limited to like the sides of roadways. They have these big remnant populations that are really cool. Some of them are just like a neighborhood that also has a prairie in it. It's really awesome, and they just manage the prairie.
Cool. Can we donate?
You can donate
I don't.
to UL, and I think.
Yeah, I don't know. You could donate manpower. I'm not sure how that works actually.
These prairie remnants, is that highway state right of way, or are these privately owned? I would think half and half maybe.
So I think depending on the remnant, it was like maybe Louisiana leased it to the highway or to railroad, and then so it's still Louisiana or it's still railroad, something like that. I can't recall. But it's not private. They have like a certain amount of land that's.
You don't know the easement?
No.
30 feet from the center of the highway.
30 feet. That's why all of them are like 30 feet.
Right
Yeah.
onto the road.
So, in answer to the question about Texas's prairie societies, they have multiple prairie societies.
Oh, do they?
Some devoted to conserving the ones that are already there, some to restoring, and then the one that's most similar to our prairies is the coastal prairies.
Yeah, so sorry, Texas has a lot of different prairies. Just like we have a lot of different prairies, they have a little bit more up north that are not part of that coastal prairie system. I mostly gathered from the coastal prairie system, and then Tom Younger has a bunch from the other prairies.
I'm envious of how many societies have that. But I do have a question for you, Braden. So on your slides, you said that there, for blue bluestem and switchgrass, there are documented patterns of local adaptation. So what are those that they see that's documented already? It's one of the early ones.
Yeah, it keeps like going the wrong way. Okay, cool.
Documented patterns of local adaptation.
So specifically for switchgrass, I mean, the phenomenon of local adaptation is that they're adapted to their local environment. So it's like where we've where we've tested these plants in research, we've found local adaptation. So it's not kind of like a pattern, like a gradient.
So there's not particular phenotypes you're looking at. You're just seeing they do better.
Yeah, we're doing that with the phenotypes. Now there is some kind of reproductive isolation between some of the northern stuff and the southern stuff due to some glaciation events that happen. I think the switchgrass in the north is mostly octoploid, whereas in the south it's tetraploid. So there's actual chromosomal and genome-wide isolation of the reproduction. So you start to see different phenotypes occurring. They're smaller in the north, shorter in the south, or taller and widespread in the south.
Okay, that's great.